Christer Bruun, welcome to Bendiksen Airways.
Thank you very much.
You live in Toronto, Canada, and if you watch your neighbors, are there similarities in the US now to the crumbling of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, that's a good and interesting question. And you mean our neighbors south of the border, of course. Indeed, yes. Yeah, I would say definitely that's how it is. And you just can't avoid thinking about these similarities, So how do you keep a republic going? And it was a question for the Romans. And they managed to keep the republic for centuries, much longer, of course, than what the US has been in existence now. But eventually the republic crumbled and they got an emperor, they got a king. So there are so many uncanny similarities these days.
Would you like to expand on them?
Yeah, I mean, a republic basically means that, there is some way of influencing those who are in power, and there is a rotation. Of course, the Romans, famously, according to their own legend, very important in their sort of identity, the Romans got enough of their king. They had monarchy for centuries, and eventually the king became too arrogant, and so he was expelled. And then the leading citizens, of course, the upper class, they decided that they have to divide power between themselves. And eventually they gave some possibilities to influence also to the citizens, the free male citizens. They had elections every year. Leaders knew they have a chance during their year in office to do things, but there is also the legislative body, the Senate, as it was called. They pass the laws. The magistrates, the leaders, the consuls, praetors, they have to obey the laws. They can propose laws, of course. They can try to influence decisions, but there is the Senate. So there is this tripartite structure because division of power, because there is also the Popular Assembly. And that's an institution where all adult male citizens meet up. They can pass laws. They can also not pass laws proposed to them. And that's where they will elect the leaders for the coming year. So this is basically how a republic functions. And again, if we think about the US as it has been for centuries, that's how it works there as well. Division of power. The president, of course, very important, 4 years. Maybe re-elected only once, though. And then you have Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and they are elected. And yeah, they have lots of power. I think in the US, of course, power over the purse. They can decide what are we going to do with what's in the treasury, what are we going to be paying for, and so forth. And then in the US, you also have the Supreme Court, of course, while, in Rome, I think you could say the tripartition is the people's influence, the aristocracy, the elite, their possibility of influencing, and then the elected magistrates whose term in power is short. So republic, that's how it works. And of course, the opposite is when you have an almighty king who has to listen to no one, listen to his friends, presumably, but also the friends depend on the goodwill of the emperor or the king, and just makes all the decisions. And that's what the Romans eventually got as the Emperor Augustus became the first on the throne after 400 years or more of our republic back in 31 BCE. So over 2,000 years ago, Rome lost the republic and became, successful. Of course, the imperial state, you can say for sure.
What kind of signs do you see in the US that they might be going towards, not being a democratic country anymore?
So, I mean, I'm of course only an observer looking on from the side. But while my profession is that of a Roman historian, I certainly am very interested in modern day social events as well. So, of course, I read what observers in the United States are writing about their own society. And And you can't avoid realizing how worried many in the US are these days. And they've been for some time, of course. I mean, the current president is in his second term, and in between there was Joe Biden. But already during the first presidency of Donald Trump, there were worries that things weren't done exactly like tradition required, and sort of behavior, the expected behavior was different. So yeah, now these tendencies for sure have strengthened now, and yeah, so it sort of in some ways fits, of course, the conflicts also simmering under the surface. Yeah, I mean. Who knows where it will end up? Everyone hopes things will move in a sort of good direction eventually. But as we know, after the presidential elections in November 2020, there was, or eventually the inauguration of the new President Biden, there was kind of an uproar in Washington, D.C., the storming of the Capitol, those kind of things, so that's very unusual. That's actually extremely unusual in the context of U.S. policy and politics. And yeah, one hopes it was a one-time only thing and not the beginning of something else.
Yeah. Before we move on to the Roman Empire, how would you introduce yourself?
So yeah, good question. Now I would say I'm a Swedish-speaking Finn. I'm from Finland originally. That's from where my PhD is. My mother tongue is Swedish. We have a Swedish-speaking minority in Finland. By constitution, Finland is bilingual, of course. So I'm bilingual too. I mean, I certainly speak Finnish fluently. And I am an immigrant in Canada. I've lived here now for quite some time already. I immigrated because of the job opportunities offered me at the University of Toronto, and my profession is that of a Roman historian. That's what I teach, as well as Latin literature. So that's what I do, and I highly enjoy it. I really think also my own university is a world-leading one, and it's a great place to be at. Yeah.
Nice. So, do you think it's inevitable that every empire goes through these cycles of maybe being a monarchy, democratic, and then authoritarian again?
So yeah, I mean, when we talk about empires, so those would be political units larger than sort of a state, a small state. There can be larger states as well, but an empire, I think by that we mean a power which has expanded outside of its ethnic or linguistic borders, and also now incorporates regions from elsewhere which wouldn't naturally be part of that state. So that's an empire. I mean, I think that empires generally have been created by states ruled by a one person, by monarchies. Now, Athens, ancient Greek Athens, a state which flourished before the Romans, of course, was a democracy, and Athens did build an empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, the islands, coast of modern Turkey, all of that. So there you do have an empire built by a state where you have citizens meeting up, discussing, electing, and so forth. But otherwise, you have empires everywhere, all continents, and just thinking Africa, South America, Asia, Europe. I mean, normally these are monarchies. I mean, there are kings who are at the head of the government, and sometimes they may have there may be some constitutional limitations. I mean, the United Kingdom, sure enough, Magna Carta, there are some, Parliament has something to say that I think one can say about the British Empire. Other empires, I'm not even an expert on most of them. So I think normally though it is a one-man rule, or one-woman rule sometimes, which is at the head of an empire.
Yeah. So how was the life for an ordinary person in the Roman Empire, far from the centers of power?
Yeah, so a good question. Of course, that's what interests us today very much. One travels around in countries which once belonged to, under Roman rule, and a question to ask. So first of all, I would say, yeah, what is the Roman Empire? That's also important to define in some ways, because we are talking about a history which covers about 1,000 years. According to the legend, Rome was founded in 753 BCE. So what 2,700 years before now. But then you have indeed those 250 years of monarchy, which is a fairly hazy period. We really don't know many facts about it. Then you have the Republic from 500 BCE. And then Rome begins to grow. And of course, it's based on its citizen army. There are many states, many populations in Italy itself that Rome has to deal with several hundred years. And then eventually the Republic crumbles. Then you have Augustus. By now, Rome certainly has expanded vastly in the Mediterranean. So now it's correct to talk about the Roman Empire, because Spain is a province, North Africa, part of it is a province, part of Western Turkey is a province, and they get Egypt soon after. Now it's an empire. So maybe this is the period you are thinking about. But one must always keep track of which century are you talking about, and which part of the Mediterranean world are you talking about. Like even today in Europe, you say, oh, how is it to live in Europe today? You say, you come from, maybe from India or something. Then you say, well, I live in Norway, huh? Somebody else says, well, I live in the UK. Somebody else says, I live in Poland. How do you mean Europe, So you have always to be aware of this. But one thing you can say for sure is, like in pre-industrial societies, things were often very tough for the ordinary person. Now, regardless of whether this was during the Greek period or period before the Romans even came, there were local populations governing themselves. Life was tough, and I think not just because it's pre-industrial, but also because it is before the discovery of antibiotics. So, infections can be so fatal. And that is why when you are thinking of the lifespan of the ordinary person, I mean, it is the averages are horrendous. Today we all know, I mean, men can expect, certainly in Norway, in most European countries, men can expect to live, I think, into the late 70s, and women maybe 5 years more. And that's the average, as we all know. Many now live past 90. Others, alas, pass away much too early. But this is nothing compared to what it was in antiquity, because looking at comparative data, we don't have statistics from the Roman period at all, but looking at comparative data, thinking this is how it must have been in the Mediterranean during the Roman period, we can say of all the babies born in a certain year, of all the babies, 5 years later, when they turn 5, only a little bit over half of them are still alive. So most of them die in their first year, and maybe even in their first months. But then there is a regular high mortality. But by year 5, you can say, okay, so out of 100 in our village, 55 children are still around. So that's all good. And then mortality is somewhat reduced. So of these, let's say 55 children, a good number will also sort of reach their 20s, but mortality continues to be a problem. Then it's a little bit different for men and for women. It is now a period when men are off to war very much. Women, of course, their task, their unavoidable situation is they will give birth, and that can be a huge risk. So women are reduced because of that, and even the smallest infection, it's not treatable. It will eventually maybe lead to blood poisoning and death. So this is why if you take the average of a cohort saying, okay, here are 100 babies born this year, what is the average lifespan? 22 years, maybe 25 years, you can say. But mind you, if you are 7 years, it means you have many years left because you have survived the worst part of it all. So there were certainly many, many people with gray hair around in the Roman world and in villages all over the empire. Of course, there were people who were old, who were in their 60s, in their 70s, but they had lost so many of their coevals born in the same year as they.
So maybe a better question would be, at the height of the Roman Empire, where were the most affluent parts, both thinking about life expectancy, but also economics? I guess they go hand in hand often.
Yeah, that's another good question. And so here, scholars have different views on these things as well. That's
and
also
when was
important.
the height of the empire?
Yeah, good question. That too. So I would say this is an old saying. Famous Roman historian Edward Gibbon, he considered the 2nd century CE, so from like 100 CE, till 200, as the best period of human history ever. He wrote in the 1700s. Maybe he was right, but I think there is this concept of Pax Romana, Roman peace, which Rome had conquered, was ruling over pretty much everything you could reach in the Mediterranean and to the south, to the north, east, to the west, of course, there is the Atlantic. So there was Roman peace. Didn't mean there weren't fighting in some places, but overall not much. So the period of Roman peace must have been conducive to business, to export, import, to tending to your field without fear that an army will march past and take everything, take your horses, burn your buildings, the period of Roman peace. So 2nd century CE, largely, I think, yeah, that would be it. But yeah, so that's now I forgot the first question you had here in relation to
which part of the empire.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Yeah. So here you have again to distinguish between cities and the countryside. So that we talk about urbanization, the rate of urbanization. How many people live in a city or town or even sort of densely populated village, and how many live out in the countryside? As today, of course, in all over the world, cities are growing. To be sure, in some places the suburbs are growing, but basically cities are getting bigger and bigger, and that's how it's been now for quite a long time. There was some of that in the Roman world as well, and some scholars who are really focusing on this urbanization rate think that anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, anywhere urbanization was the highest in the Roman world. So they managed to do it, which means, of course, also that city folks don't produce anything to eat, so they depend on importing all their food stuff. So then one can discuss how did that then work? Is it that they provided services and produced things, industrial products, that then the people in the countryside were happy to buy, and so there was an exchange? Or is it an empire in which you simply tax everybody else and then take from them, and so you feed the cities, and then they are much worse off in the countryside? There is a much discussion about this, so many scholars might have a maybe very pessimistic view on this, saying, of course, all the cities, they were parasitic. Others might say, well, no, of course, the cities are great centers of productivity and this and that, so it was more of an equal exchange here. But when it comes to lifespan and the quality of life, I think there was a trade-off. Then many people think that living in a city was not healthy, and here it's a question of sewers. What to do with the refuse? Bacteria, hey, you can't help it. It smells, but it not only smells, it will also, spread all kinds of diseases. So then today's scholars ask, so wasn't it the case? You moved to the city, wow, everything is going on here, this is so nice and exciting, and then you fall ill, and then you die, and then you don't realize this is because you lived in a city. You should have stayed in your village, out there on your farm, and it would have had fresh air all around. No entertainment, maybe less exciting food, you don't meet anybody, but maybe it's healthier. So that's one thing to think about, at least.
I see. I'm reading Mary Beard's book now, the latest one on the Roman Empire. But how much can we actually know happened for sure?
Yeah. Now, yeah, again, a very major question for Roman historians, for all of us, and also when we talk to our students. So when it comes to these tricky issues such as demography, precisely lifespan and mortality, what do these diseases mean? How many do we think should have died under these circumstances? Scholars just have to work with comparative material. So maybe they have, some accurate data, or at least some data from, I don't know, from Ecuador in the 1800s, in some large city in Ecuador, or Peru, or something like that, and say, okay, we see mortality is very high here. Probably the situation is similar to what was in Rome. Or Pakistan, they study a very large city of Pakistan is warmer than the Mediterranean. But anyway, and then they say, let's assume that this was the situation in Rome. And then they write a book and they say, I admit this is hypothetical, but probably this is how it was. And then other Roman historians have to say, well, I don't believe you, or I think this is the wrong analogy. You should find something which is closer. Debate, moves forward in this way.
I see. So can you speak a bit about the power structures, power systems, and how we think it worked, at least?
So again, if we look first at the Republic, of course, it was an aristocratic republic. That's how it was set up. The ruling elite, in those days when it all started back in the early 400s BCE, so we are talking about a few hundred families. Wealthy ones with many so-called clients, so regular folk, Roman citizens who felt indebted or who felt sort of happy to be protected by these big leaders. So when then there is still going to be elections every year, but that's when you tell all those people who sort of listen to you, okay, my son is a candidate, you know whom to vote for, and then that's what they do. So this is sort of the power structure, very traditional. There can be changes, of course, from time to time, obviously, and some people come from outside of the power structure and they just do well. And they do well financially, economically. They are maybe lucky. They maybe have a very strong and courageous son who rises in the army, who everybody loves. He's a candidate. That may also lead to him being elected. And then you are already, a powerful man. You have a son who actually prefers to stay at home, who maybe isn't the sharpest, You say, I want to have him elected anyway. It doesn't work. There is a challenger coming from the outside, and that's how it can work. But yeah, basically it's an aristocratic republic. Things may change a bit later on, towards the end of the Republic, when Rome is already an empire for sure, and taxation has been abolished in Italy because there is so much tax coming from the provinces, and people can sort of really see that this is paying off to some extent. But a very huge problem there, of course, but which also impacted ultimately power structure, which we haven't mentioned yet, and that is, of course, slavery. Slavery was everywhere. This was the most natural thing in the world, in the Roman Empire. You have slaves. Some people are slaves. And that may have had a very negative effect on, well, of course, on the slaves themselves, but also on free farmers in Italy who sort of had their small plots and, of course, also produced for the market. And then in the end, we're not competitive when it came to trying to sell their goods, just because large slave estates were able to sort of mass production of wine and grain and oil and so forth, leads to social problems in Rome. And that also sort of rattles the power structure and seems to open up a possibility for, as some say, demagogues, and then you have candidates in these elections it's it's easy to look to modern parallels, which can be very misleading. But maybe some of these demagogues who are challenging now the ruling elite are saying, make Rome great again. This doesn't work for us. We've lost our land. And there are all these rich, SOBs who are running their slave estates. We want to put our men now in power. There are conflicts, and there are also conflicts which the Romans don't manage to solve anymore. So the power is always held by individual, really strong men. Some of them, towards the end, are maybe more demagogues than sort of traditional aristocracy. It all breaks up. Eventually civil war, of course, a century of civil wars from time to time, and this is really a bloody civil war with many men who fell, of course, plunders and whatnot. And then one of these last civil warlords is the man who becomes the Emperor Augustus, who takes sole power. But yeah, so speaking again about power structures, from then on, everything really changes. But the first emperor is very clever. He knows what happens to anyone in Rome who says, I want to be king, I should be king. The Romans had this traditional aversion against kingship. They knew once upon a time they had a bad king, they threw him out. Now they have a res publica, as they say in Latin. We talk about a republic, which is sort of our communal matter, sort of. Res publica. Augustus said, I have restored the republic. Luckily, you have me now, I have restored the republic, but we are just continuing as before. It wasn't true at all. Now it was the emperor who had the power. The Senate was still there. They held elections, but things were sort of predetermined very largely. So the power structure remains in many ways similar in the sense that it is still a state, of course, where the wealthy elite dominates and is given a possibility to dominate. The only thing is now there is always one above, and that person has power over life and death in reality if he wants it. He has a court as well, of course, many advisors who may not at all be from the elite. Many of the advisors, most important ones, were freed slaves who were very experienced, educated, and gave advice to the emperors.
Is there some similarity with what you said now to the Russian state now?
I think you can find it. Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I think it's a phenomenon which, reading what commentators are saying, these days we have these autocratic states with one leader, but there are elections still. So it looks as if, things are as they should be. But in reality, elections are managed from above, and the outcome is, in the most cases, quite clear. And yeah, so it's a sham in some ways, and for sure, the Roman state was built up just like that from about 30 BCE forward for several centuries till the fall of Rome.
But isn't it right that before this, they sometimes brought in dictators who actually stepped down on their own accord?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So when they came up with the constitution, we can say, for the Roman Republic, they were very careful to have always two people in the same office. So two consuls. That's unusual. We normally, when we have presidents, we don't have two presidents. No, we don't have two prime ministers. We have only one. The Romans said, when one man has power, that's not good. We should have two. So they always had two consuls, several praetors, and so forth. That was very important. But they also realized there may be a very, very critical time when perhaps we have weak people in the lead for that particular year, when they can't agree. So what do we then? So then we have to take recourse to this one institution, which is that of a dictator. But again, it's clearly established a dictator is chosen for 6 months, and he has to fix the problem, a military one, possibly, civil discord. Maybe one part of the population is very unhappy. He has to broker peace, compromise, and then he steps down at the latest after 6 months. And that worked. It worked for centuries. So it was an honor to be a dictator. It was a tough job too. You did it, and then you continued with your life. And I would say, speaking of the dictator, and again the Republican Constitution, one thing which I think the Romans did so well, one thing where we really can learn is the willingness of the actually ruling elite to forge compromises. So the information we have about the centuries of republic is there were always these crises. There were always these situations where some part of the population, often obviously the poorer ones, the normal people, they were not happy. And they didn't get their will immediately acknowledged, but the leaders made compromises slowly, and sometimes there were big steps towards sharing power and allowing others to contribute to the sort of ruling processes of the republic. I think it's a remarkable sort of wisdom that somehow materialized. I don't know exactly, or our historical accounts give names of people who were instrumental in forging these compromises, and maybe it was really them. That's certainly possible. Somehow, to my mind, they seem to have had an understanding of how we need to integrate more larger parts of the population to make everyone sort of chime in and play along. And that worked for a very, very long time. And suddenly in like 130 BC, it's over. They don't do compromises anymore. Those who are in power clearly say, nope, we won't do that. This is unfair. No, it's going to infringe, on our privileges. We seem to we have to give up some land that we have illegally taken, but now it's ours. We won't do that. They kill a tribune of the people in 133, which had never been done before. He was sort of the spokesman. There were 10 tribunes. They were spokesmen for the common people. They killed one of them. And the Roman Republic never healed from it. It was such a serious wound. But the willingness to forge compromises, to give something to those who don't have, that willingness was gone, and yeah, that's a very important part of the fall of the Republic, I would say.
What kind of other wisdoms do you think we should take from history of Rome?
Yeah, so I would say indeed this would be a primary thing to learn, the willingness to actually compromise. There's another thing also which has to do with how you integrate, new people into the state. And so on the one hand, there is citizenship, which was, it was valuable. As we all know today, of course, EU citizenship is very valuable. Some people say US citizenship is valuable. Certainly Canadian citizenship is valuable. And only when you have that, you really have everything in the country, if you happen to live in the EU or Canada and so on. You can live there before even, but the citizenship is really important. So the Romans gave out citizenship, but not to everyone and not at once. So that's one thing. They were sort of a bit choosy here. Divide and rule is what this principle is called. So that's one thing. Free individuals, how do they become integrated? Eventually, Rome gave it to every free person living in the empire. The other thing is slaves. And of course, slaves, in some places there were more of them. In other parts of the empire, there were not that many. So most farmers were free and so forth, but there were millions of slaves. The Romans were very special in that they allowed for slaves gaining their freedom. So that's an institutional part of the Roman society. Slaves gain their freedom. The will of the owner, of course, is important here. The owner, whether man or woman, decides to free the slave, and then there is a formal process which is sort of fairly a formality often only, and then the slaves gain Roman citizenship. And that is actually something quite important, I think, when it comes to assimilating and integrating people from the outside. And again, slavery is a huge topic today, alas, because of modern slavery, which I would say I've been teaching courses on Roman slavery for quite some time. And I would say 20 years ago, if I had said, and it's also an issue today, students would have said like slavery. But now we know that, yeah, absolutely, human trafficking and all of that is slavery. It is a modern phenomenon, but mostly in the study of the Roman world, what people are thinking of is, of course, slavery in the US. So that is what it is. Slavery in the US still today has such an enormous impact on certainly societies in North America. And of course, also because, we are all Americanized, it has an impact on Europe as well. But very different situation. So in the Roman world, there was no racism involved in slavery. And that is a very big thing. So we can find nothing about it, nothing indicating that there was any racial barriers to actually being freed from slavery and being welcomed into the Roman citizen body. And, we have many legal paragraphs and rulings from the Roman world, because one of the greatest achievements of the Roman mind, as we can say, was the legal thought. There was, I think, never before, perhaps possibly not later, a society so focused on the law and on developing legal thinking as the Romans. Today, of course, it doesn't play that much of a role at all, but once upon a time it did, and through the Middle Ages. Anyway, we have many legal passages on slavery specifically. Some of, you can realize what slavery was about, all these gruesome details, this horrible subjugation of human beings. Never anywhere is there anything about race. There is never anything saying, because we know, for instance, the first Emperor Augustus he thought that Romans tended to free their slaves a little bit too much. So he set certain rules for it. So if you own 10 slaves, you can free 3 in your testament, or if you own 50 slaves, you can free 15 in your testament. I don't remember the numbers, but something like that. He could very easily have inserted, unless it's a Gallic slave, or you can free so and so many slaves from Egypt, you cannot free German slaves. Or, the Romans were very well aware of these ethnicities. They talk about them in their literature, the Gauls, the Germans, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Thracians. They were absolutely aware of people who came from these regions, spoke that language, maybe had some, hairdo, especially, trousers, the Germans, all of that. There is never anything about certain people not qualifying for Roman citizenship after they had been slaves. Again, I think they know that's a good thing, in the midst of this horrible thing which slavery is. It shows the Romans' acceptance of diversity, of foreigners, and I think that's something for us also to remember, It can work. The Roman state grew stronger, did not grow weaker after sort of accommodating over centuries, millions of freed slaves who, I guess one has to say, these freed slaves were often probably, the most industrious, maybe they were sucking up to their masters. That's only possible, but they were of benefit to their masters, and that's why the masters, as a reward, then freed them. They started out perhaps at a decent level of wealth and continued. Their children were free-born, so now capable or able to candidates for offices as well, advance in society, so social mobility. But it starts out with slavery, obviously a horrible institution.
What were the rights of women?
The rights of women, yeah. So women never able to vote, never able to hold any of these obviously elected offices. Since very early on in Rome itself, in the capital, there are the Vestal Virgins. So this is a group of indeed virgins. They start as very young girls. They live secluded, and they worship the goddess Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, sort of the house. So their activities sort of symbolize what goes on in any in any farmer's house, when there's maybe some place where you also worship the gods of the house and your ancestors, the Vestal Virgins do it on behalf of the whole Roman people, of the state. So you can have female priestesses. You can also have it in Roman towns. We can find it in inscriptions. So to some extent, they can play this kind of a public role. But generally, for sure, there are these texts talking about the weaker sex, and the weaker in the sense that irrational, aren't able to make well-founded decisions. That is what characterizes women. This is, you can absolutely find it established as some kind of a fact. So
that's a sort of racism.
Sorry?
Racism. You can maybe say that's the sort of racism.
Well, you would say it's a sexism. I mean, for sure, yeah. Because again, this goes for person who has lived in Italy for generations, absolutely true, and Italian woman as well as somebody from modern Tunisia or from Spain. They are all women, and alas, they lack this quality which luckily we males have. This is sort of the standard. However, as Roman history develops, even during the Republic early on, from time to time, one sees very strong-willed women who certainly have an impact on what happens. Women band together and collect, valuables to help the war effort. Women are important in some, building temples and so forth. So of course, women were there, and women worked the land, obviously, strong women out in the countryside, in the city. They have to be sure married to important figures, but this is an informal way of influencing that sometimes came out in the open, just because these women said, we demand this, we demand that. And then the senator said, what's going on here? We thought women actually, didn't have any will or any ideas, but these seem to have it. They had to accept it somehow. But quite important here is the issue of property, of ownership. So for all of us, I think the fact that we own or don't own some wealth also impacts what we can do in society and whether people will listen to us. So on the one hand, women, daughters inherited the same as other siblings. So Roman society was not one in which you said all of the deceased property goes to the sons, the women should better get married because they get nothing. No, Roman society was one in which each girl had the same right to inherit, the same portion then from what was left after some legates had been given out, the same portion as any brother. Even if the brother was an important military man at this point, needing money for who knows what, the girl got it too. So that's good, you could say, speaking of equality of sexes. But when it comes to how to dispose over your property, women, again, because considered, not able to make rational decisions, there had to be a mentor. There had to be a mentor, somebody who actually looked over her shoulder and signed off. So this is the situation as we approach the end of the Republic. Scholars have looked at the indications that women actually are playing a role and financially playing a role in society, and they are saying clearly things became less regulated as we move forward. So even 1st century BCE, women seem to be playing some role in financial life, and even more during the first 2 centuries of the empire. So I think it must have been a result of the fact that ever more women are saying, what is this nonsense? You mean my brother is more intelligent or thoughtful than I am? This is crazy. And you have more and more of these voices, and they somehow they reconfigure reality, it seems. So the law did not particularly much change, but reality did change. In some cases, there were also changes in the law made so that women had larger freedom over their property. And so there are for sure rich heiresses, and they also use their money. We can see that here we come to inscriptions. So many ancient inscriptions carved on marble, talking about buildings, naming them, but very often talking about who financed this building. We see that also in today's world sometimes. Sponsors are very happy to have their name on a building, right? Sports arenas and whatnot. In the Roman world, I mean, this is the Roman tradition, of course. That's what the Romans did. And we see, yes, very often women who are sponsoring, a public bath building, a temple, maybe, even paving the street, a fountain, an aqueduct, these kind of things. So women are disposing over their property, and I think because they are rich, people will listen to them. So this informal way of influencing. But again, maybe I'm painting too rosy a picture because yeah, of course, the situation was not equal overall.
You said inscriptions there. How much do we rely on inscriptions and administrative documents versus literary sources?
Yeah, so again, a very essential matter when it comes to understanding Roman civilization. Luckily, we have so many texts, literary texts surviving from the Roman world. I mean, of course, written in Latin, sometimes in Greek. I mean, educated Romans were bilingual. Of course, they could read Greek texts and they appreciated them. And the Greek texts were older, so Greeks were sort of pioneers, but the Romans did their best to create their own literature, and that's what they did. So Latin poetry, very much respected. So really, if you were an author, then you should be able to write poetry, for sure. But so many other kinds of literature also, history and geography and medical texts and texts about aqueducts and military matters, very important, letters and so forth. Anyway, they give us, I would say, what really is the reason we engage with the Romans. Because from the literary texts, we see what a fascinating culture it is. We see what these authors were thinking. We see their descriptions. We can connect to their ideas, all of that. So, but a society is so very multidimensional. And these authors, of course, were writing for the educated elite, I guess. I think many people could read in the Roman world, but how many would really have time and money to buy these scrolls, and sit and read them? We don't know. But when it comes to average Romans or middle class, which is a modern concept, but let's just talk about that. So then we are dependent on inscriptions, on above all on tomb inscriptions, on funerary inscriptions. So for the Romans, when you pass, when you die, you go somewhere else, of course. Your spirit is still somewhere, and you can, of course, hope to end up in a good place. You will be remembered. You will be venerated. Your relatives will come to your tomb. This should at least once a year come to your tomb, maybe on your birthday, and offer sacrifices. You want your tomb to look nice, but the tomb should also have your name. Of course, it's so important. Everybody should know this is where you are buried. And if you have the money to order, a marble plaque a little bit bigger, if you have the money to hire somebody to inscribe you, this is a stone cutter, it, takes expertise, nice letters and so forth, then you will want this text to say a bit more about yourself. So should mention, of course, your full name, should mention maybe something what your profession was, maybe mention something if you had traveled, if you're a military person, of course, in which legions did you serve. Also, of course, should mention something about your family, maybe, maybe you are doing it for actually your spouse who passed before you. So then you will mention the name of your spouse, whether it's a woman now or a man, and you mention at the end your own name, and maybe you add like, I'm still alive, but everybody realizes one day you will be here as well. We get so much information. There are hundreds of thousands of these inscriptions, and this is a category which is growing every year. new inscriptions are still being found everywhere, in Spain, in Algeria, in Turkey, in Greece, Bulgaria, Germany, everywhere. So, and they tell us about more average Romans, about their ideas, about their experiences, about their names too, about their status, because this is something you can also mention. Are you freeborn? So do you write out that you are the son or a daughter of a Roman citizen? Then we know, okay, this is a freeborn. No wonder, free person from birth, very fancy monument, clearly a wealthy person. Then you can draw this conclusion. But then you can also mention if you are a freed slave, which surprisingly enough, many people do. You might say, well, if you were a slave once, you want to keep silent about that. Don't mention anyone that you are a slave. I'm just, like Mr. Average here. No, very often they mention that they were freed slaves. For us modern historians, it's very useful to see. So on the one hand, they are not ashamed that once upon a time they were slaves. They, in fact, are proud. It means they've made it. I made it. And they are often investing quite considerable sums in the funerary monument. So that is also a good indication that they were actually wealthy. They got their freedom and brought some money maybe with them from their former owner, but then they continued to thrive in, business life, commerce, whatever. And in the end, as a crown to their life on earth, nice funerary monument, which will forever, keep their memory, which is true because we have found it now. So they are still with us, we can still follow the fate of these individuals. It's eternal, their memory. So very interesting. But this is what inscriptions give us. We can do statistics. This is what scholars do, In this particular town, do we see mostly freeborn individuals? Do we mostly see freed slaves? Sometimes we even see slaves. Slaves, of course, also needed to be buried. And sometimes there is somebody who takes care also to carve this particular, lasting monument. Often they could do it on a piece of wood, that's rotted away long ago. But sometimes even on stone, so-and-so, slave of so-and-so is buried here. That gives us information too.
Yeah. We spoke earlier about the life of the ordinary man. And what about religious freedom, sexual freedom? How was that?
Yeah. Again, a good question. I have to say, religion. So Roman society, like most societies in the ancient world, was polytheistic. So the Romans believed in many gods. The fundamental idea of the Romans was there are gods everywhere. One can't name them. There are so many. They even sort of thought that there would be a nymph or a god in every fountain, in every river. If you wanted, you could pray to the river of your, to the god of your nearby river. There isn't enough fish here. Please, or there's too little water here. We can't water our fields. Please, let it rain. But so they had, of course, about 12 sort of really most important gods. But even if you think about important temples for gods in Roman cities, the number is much larger, surely 20, maybe 30. But besides that, anywhere, anyone's god was sort of acceptable, because again, this is sort of the Roman tolerance, I would say. Romans were absolutely tolerant, with some exceptions. That appears already in the Republic. Dionysus, a Greek god, a god of wine. But the god of wine also means drunkenness, and drunkenness also leads to sexual activities. Dionysus' cult also accommodated women. This was a religious form which did not really appeal to the leaders, to the Roman leaders, because people do kinds of stupid things, they thought, when they are drunk, and there is this kind of mix of the sexes, transgressions, whatnot. So they actually did try to sort of moderate the Dionysic cult. It's continued to live for sure, and is well known during the empire. So it was there. Some people may have sneered at it, but it certainly also was a popular religion. The main thing here is monotheism, so many gods, many gods. That can cause problems because Rome, after all, conquered all of the Mediterranean, meaning also Palestine, Judea. And there is the Jewish population. And of course, famously monotheistic. There is only one God, and that is such a fundamental part of the Jewish belief. Islam is the same, but Islam is after Rome. So Rome had no connection with Islam. Muhammad comes in the 600s, and that's later. But the Jewish religion is there. So the Jewish population was lucky in some ways because Caesar, who well known, I think, and was the predecessor of Augustus, the first emperor. Caesar was murdered because people suspected he wanted to become emperor. Okay, didn't work. He was murdered. Augustus takes over, much more clever anyway. But Caesar had experiences with Jewish communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they did him services. So he was positively disposed towards them. He realized they don't think like we, but it didn't matter to him. He gave them certain privileges. So the Jewish population had certain privileges from that date onwards, and that helped them in many ways. Then some of the emperors very undiplomatically anyway tried to infringe on the Jewish population, convincing them that, besides their own God, they should also venerate the Roman emperor or past Roman emperors, which were gods. And this was, of course, enormously offensive to the Jews. So then you have a rebellion in Judea in 66 CE, and you have another one very complicated, I mean, not successful, of course, but huge, much warfare in the 130s. That's the story of the Jews. So there were Jews in Rome, they had their own congregations, and there were Jews elsewhere. But yeah, the situation eventually wasn't ideal, but the Jews, as far as I know, were not persecuted also for one important reason. The Jewish monotheists were not interested in increasing their numbers. As the saying goes, they were not proselytizing. They were happy with who they were. Their children continued. If someone wanted to join, I think there were tough rules and sort of qualifications before they could be accepted. So the Romans said, okay, this is a sect. They do what they do. At least, we know where they are, and that's what it is. The Christians, then, that's obviously the other group of monotheists. The Christians, okay, we can't even talk about them before maybe 33 CE. Tiberius, the second emperor, is in power. 33 CE, that's when traditionally it's thought that Jesus Christ suffered death on the cross.
Yeah, I have to ask you about that. What do we know about the Roman dealings with Jesus?
So I think that we have to say that, I mean, something really went on there, a historical figure, something must have happened, crucifixion, something. I think famously in the Bible, there is the Roman leader, Roman authorities is represented by a man called Pontius Pilatus. I think the name is still maybe familiar. We know that he existed because his name appears in an inscription from Judea. So that is absolutely true. There was a Roman governor, or in the place of a governor, called Pontius Pilatus. And of course, these are the kind of things he would have to deal with. Somebody saying something which is, arousing the people, causing some kind of commotion. What is he saying? I don't even know. I don't speak his language. Maybe Pontius Pilatus says, well, your task is to make things calm down. Please make them calm down. This was the Roman general policy. In the provinces, we don't want trouble. Calm down the situation, do as little damage as possible, but please make people stop. We want provinces to be calm. People should work. They should pay taxes. Then we are happy. So here, absolutely, it's possible that there is, clearly that's what happened. Somebody is active in Judea. He has a message. That message causes, many people to come to his help or to his side. Maybe traditional Jewish leaders don't like him at all. And who knows, then it goes the way it goes. What we can't deny is Christians began to appear. Then you have people who say we are, following the teachings of our Master Jesus Christ. He died for us. Some people had even seen him, I think. For many decades there would be those people around who said, "Yes, I saw him. I heard him speak. Absolutely." And so the message spreads around. In 64 in Rome, there is a horrible fire in Rome, and Nero, an emperor who has a bad reputation, he was emperor then. He wasn't in Rome when it broke out. The fire went on for many days, as they can. We know it from modern times. They can never put out these fires in California and so forth. But Nero came up and apparently then sat on his roof of his palace, playing a sad tune, looking at Rome burning. What else could he do? He was just a single person. But anyway, he should have taken more care for the population. But then he needed a scapegoat, it seems. The damage was so great and somebody had to be blamed. Because how could it happen? We live in the Roman world. The emperor is our leader. The gods protect us. Somebody must have done something. This could not have happened otherwise. And then Nero says, the Christians, there we have it. The Christians have offended our gods because the Christians say there's only one God and that's their God. Everybody else is not real. The gods must have been offended by these Christians. And look what happened. Then Rome burns. So he instituted persecutions, as they are called. So then it's a question of round up those Christians. They are guilty. They maybe not have, physically lighted the fire, but by their behavior, they have so ruptured, broken the sort of accord between the gods and us, and they must be punished. And this continued to be. So anyway, there were certainly executions, martyrs, as they are called, those who died for their faith. The Christians were very different from the Jews because they were trying to recruit more believers. The Christians were, in fact, driven by, they had this drive. We must have more people convert. This is the only way to save them. If you don't convert, if you don't acknowledge Jesus Christ, you will go to hell. We don't want that to happen to our neighbors. We have to convince them. They are nice people, but they are misled now. So then you go out to do everything you can to convert them. What do the Roman authorities say? What are you doing? What are you doing? The Roman state, we've been going strong for 800 years because we are worshipping all the gods and they are all protecting us. And now you are coming from nowhere and you are saying we are doing it wrong and you have your own God. For heaven's sake, what's going on here? You are actually a damage. You're a danger to our society. So this became a problem. And one thing in particular, well, the Christians could not worship any other god, of course. The Romans had a wide variety to offer, a wide variety. You can choose. You can choose. Nay, I won't choose anyone else except my own Christian God. Okay. In the Roman world, you also did worship the spirit of the ruling emperor. And of course, you did worship all the past emperors. And this was the one thing which united everyone living in the Roman Empire. So, you live in so many different modern countries, 30 modern countries belong to the Roman Empire. People spoke different languages. They had different cultural practices. They had no clue about what's going on anywhere else. One thing they knew, there is the Roman Emperor. Of course, you have coins as well with images of the Roman Emperor. But the Roman Emperor was the one unifying factor in the whole world, in the whole Western world. And then you have the Christians, and they are trying to tear away the fundament of the Roman world, which is worshipping the emperor, who is protecting us all. And the Christians say, no, that's pagan thing. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I refuse. The emperor is just an ordinary guy. I have my own God. And this was really not acceptable. It was a political question. You could say in some ways, even a survival question for the Roman Empire. So, we have to deal with this, we have to deal with these Christians. But again, the Romans, at least some of these emperors, were sort of willing to strike some kind of a compromise. And it's a famous, again, literary source, a correspondence between the Roman emperor, who was Trajan at that time, so around 110 CE. Trajan, a former military man, of course, very competent in that field. But he sent his friend and loyal civil servant, you could say, Pliny the Younger, who is famous for having written many very interesting letters to friends. But he also corresponded with the emperor, and that's again interesting to see. Trajan's own, not handwriting, of course, we don't have it anymore, but his own words. Pliny asking, so he was in modern Turkey, northern Turkey, in the province of Bithynia, and Pliny had a problem there because there were these informers. So they were telling him that in this city there are these Christians. There are these Christians and they are disloyal and they are not worshipping the Roman emperor. They are doing their things, horrible things. Who knows what they are doing? They meet every Sunday. They drink blood, okay, all of these things. So Pliny was a bit uncertain. How is he going to deal with this now? So he wrote to Trajan, reporting on it and so forth. And Trajan wrote back and said, okay, so first of all, don't listen to informers. People have all kinds of reasons to inform on their neighbor. They want their land, they want this and that, they want them to disappear. Don't listen to informers. As for the Christians, don't go looking for them. Don't go looking for them, because, then you have a problem, because what do you do? But he said, and if you actually are faced with a Christian, for some reason you end up with a Christian before you, and you have to sort of sort it all out, why are you here, what have you done, and so forth. Try to make them recant, try to, we only need them to sort of pray a little bit to a statue of the emperor or something, and then you can let them go because they've done their duty. However, said Trajan, if they are absolutely unwilling to do any compromise, then you have no choice. You have to show, meaning execution, of course. But he is not an emperor who says, go after everyone, take everyone, nobody can live. He's saying, don't cause trouble, If things move along smoothly, we can live with it. Let them meet in their Sunday lunches or worshipping. But if it comes up as a blatant thing, then you cannot, of course, blink. Then you must deal with it in the proper fashion, meaning proper for them, meaning if you don't worship the emperor, you are disloyal and you have forfeited your life, probably. Yeah. So Trajan was, you could say, as humane an emperor as you can imagine in this situation. This is the old days when death penalties are not uncommon. Of course, human life, what is it worth after all, and so forth. Later on, there will be some emperors who are much more militant. So later on, you can find emperors who actually are saying, go out and chase them down, and give them a few minutes to rethink it, and if not, then it's off to the arena, and they fight. They should die in the arena fighting wild beasts or something like that. But it was a problem. The Christians, of course, were absolutely no compromise. They were absolutely militant. They're fanatic. The Christians were fanatic. The Romans were willing to all kinds of compromises, but there was a limit to what they could accept.
Yeah, interesting. So if we go to the demise, the downfall of the empire, what are the main factors, do we think?
So, this is a topic for, many podcasts, of course, and there's so many different views, many dozens of them really. And I would say one thing, though, which also is relevant for the modern world, which, I could just throw out there, is inequality. So inequality is so important. And it is undoubtedly the case that there were external threats, if we so say, when we come to the 400s CE, and later, this is a period when populations in Europe are on the move, and there is the border guarded by many Roman military units has been guarded for many centuries. But from Central Europe and from even further away, like north of the Black Sea, Ukraine, Russia, those regions, there are so many populations who I think at this point are well aware that the Roman Empire is such a rich part of the world. There are these beautiful buildings, there are riches in the vaults and treasuries of people, and where should we go? Maybe somebody is pushing on them, trying to attack them from the east, and so forth. So population growth, who knows? Maybe suddenly there isn't enough fields for them either. They've used up natural resources. They want to expand somewhere. Where are they going to go? Well, they can only go one way, and that's towards the west. And that means entering Roman territory. So there is this push from the outside. And I think part of the problem is, of course, that the Roman army is apparently not really able to put up the same kind of resistance as before. Maybe these incursions are more frequent, are larger, and they are quick. They are quickly through the border, and then they plunder. They are on horseback, and that is also very important. Now I think also the Roman legions, the infantry is not as important as before. So now I think also Rome has many more men on horseback, but which of course also costs more money. And so you can chase after the invaders, but they may be much more at home because they've grown up, on the steppes or something. Also, of course, they are hungry. The Roman soldiers are basically happy with, let's have peace, I signed up for the army, but I don't want to fight. I want peace. I want, family life. And of course, the payment that the army gives me. But those who are coming across the border from the outside says, we have nothing, they have everything. Anything I get is good. And if I get even more, even better. So that's one phenomenon the Romans have to deal with. But then the question becomes overall the mentality in the Roman provinces, because that's where the invaders come first, obviously. It's question of, the Balkans and of course, Austria, Switzerland today, Germany, France, and so forth. And so the economy has not been doing so well in Rome for some time, a long period, maybe things going downwards a little bit, except North Africa. North Africa was doing really well, but they were not much impacted by the so-called barbarian invasions, because North Africa was pretty much isolated, so they could develop their economy well. So yeah, but in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, they were doing well. But we are talking about Central Western Europe. So problems there. And so on the one hand, you can see, okay, and a certain impoverishment. So that's something which is going on overall. But then you see the contrast, and the archaeology tells us this, because then we also have archaeologists have excavated these ruins of absolutely fabulous palaces. The Roman term is villa, so people talk about villas, but they are palaces. That's what we should call them. Palaces also in the UK. I remember seeing myself some really, really fancy decorated palaces there. And these palaces show us that all the money wasn't gone, all the luxury wasn't gone, absolutely not. But I think, and many others think, that there was a larger gap maybe now between those who did not have very much at all and those who had. And they were the masters. And
that's where we're going today.
Sorry?
That's where we're going today.
So that's the thing. That's what
inequality. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. So then people are saying, maybe, in places, even northern Italy, people are saying, okay, there are these guys, they speak German. I don't understand it very well. They ride these horses, but they are saying they're going to be okay. They're going to be good to us. And what's the difference? What's the difference? Because there is a master living up on that hill. I've never even seen him. It's so big. He has all these slaves, and demands from me this and that. And this German guy seems all regular folk. Maybe I won't meet up. I won't take my weapons and try to defend his palace. I'm gonna sit still, and maybe the new arrangement is gonna work better for me. It's a possibility. I think I'm not certainly. Others have said similar things, the solidarity with, keeping the empire strong. Why? Exactly why? So, yeah.
What about younger and more incompetent emperors?
So yeah, we have. I mean, on the throne, of course, it varied, and I think in late antiquity, yeah, the situation becomes also complicated because you have. They try to stabilize the government first of all, and that's like in late 200s by instituting a system with 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors. So the empire is huge, and you just divide it up in 4 parts, trying to sort of have a changeover. So you step down as senior emperor at some point, and then the junior guy becomes the senior one. We incorporate a new junior person, a system which very much depends on trust. You have to trust all your co-emperors, and it didn't work because nobody trusted anybody. So then again, you have a single emperor, but then some brothers sometimes share the throne. And you are right, sometimes when the emperor dies, he has no son at that age capable of continuing, but then there might be a very young boy. Then somebody has to take over anyway. It's a little bit complicated, and you just realize there are challenges everywhere for the imperial throne, for the imperial government.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I mean, there's so much one could say, of course, but we've been going at it for quite some time already. I would say, the for the Republic, the willingness to compromise shown by the ruling elite, I think, is so important. Interesting is for the Romans the way they incorporated or assimilated freed slaves. Everybody had slaves in those days, and that's an inexcusable infringement on human rights, but at least they benefited from the fact that they generously gave the citizenship. Late antiquity, inequality, I think, must have been a factor in the downfall of the Western Empire. Of course, in the East, it lived on for quite some time and more.
Christer, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our talk. Really good questions that you posed.
Thank you very much. Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.